Hello, I'm the masked amp. I've got a mask and I'm an amp. I've looked at Section 2 and Section 3 of the Mental Health Act on this channel, so I'm now going to look at Section 4, which is the other civil section for admission to hospital. Section 4 is explicitly referred to as an emergency application. The AMP, when completing their form, has to state, "In my opinion, it is of urgent necessity for the patient to be admitted and detained under Section 2 of the Act, and compliance with the provisions of Part 2 of the Act relating to applications under that section would involve undesirable delay." This means that the AMP only needs one medical recommendation to make the application, rather than the two required for Section 2 or 3. The Code of Practice states, "An application for detention under Section 4 may be made only when the criteria for detention for assessment under Section 2 are met, the patient's detention is required as a matter of urgent necessity, and obtaining a second medical recommendation would cause undesirable delay." It continues, "Section 4 should be used only in a genuine emergency where the patient's need for urgent assessment outweighs the desirability of waiting for a second doctor." So, how often is Section 4 used nowadays? The use of Section 4 is rare. Many currently practicing AMPs have never used it. This is backed up by national statistics on the use of the Mental Health Act. The statistics for detentions for the year 2019 to 2020 state that out of a total of 32,011 detentions under Section 2 or 3, only 50 arose following detention under Section 4. However, things were somewhat different in the early days of the 1983 Act. In fact, between 1983 and 1990, I had to use Section 4 on 11 occasions. In the 37 years since the 1983 Act came into force, I've only used Section 4 on a total of 18 occasions, most recently over 10 years ago. There were several reasons for the frequent use of Section 4 in the early years of the Act. At that time, community-based mental health services were virtually unknown. Community psychiatric nurses barely existed. There were a lot of psychiatric beds, but not very many consultant psychiatrists, and they were all ward-based. The fee for conducting assessments was around £30. All this meant that most requests for Mental Health Act assessments came from GPs. An approved social worker would go out with the GP to assess the patient. It was almost impossible to persuade a consultant psychiatrist to leave the hospital to attend one of these appointments. A typical conversation with the psychiatrist would go something like this: "Oh, just bring them in on a Section 4 and I'll convert it to a Section 2 once they're on the ward." If the patient was acutely unwell, having to wait days for a psychiatrist to conduct a home visit meant that detaining under Section 2 would indeed involve undesirable delay. The only upside to all this was that there were always beds available. The Code of Practice suggests that to be satisfied that an emergency has arisen, the person making the application and the doctor making the supporting recommendation should have evidence of an immediate and significant risk of mental or physical harm to the patient or to others, danger of serious harm to property, or a need for the use of restrictive interventions on a patient. It makes it very clear that Section 4 is not to be used in any routine way, stating Section 4 should never be used for administrative convenience. So, for example, patients should not be admitted under Section 4 merely because it is more convenient for the second doctor to examine the patient in rather than outside hospital. Are there circumstances in which it may be necessary to consider use of Section 4 for patients detained under Section 136? When Section 136 lasted for up to 72 hours, there was little excuse for a failure to obtain 2 medical recommendations within that timescale. However, since 2018, that time limit has been reduced to 24 hours. This makes it much tighter to obtain 2 doctors for an assessment, and I'm aware that out-of-hours AMPs are often unable to get 2 doctors. In practice though, even within the difficulties arising from the current pandemic, there have not been significant problems getting 2 doctors within the current time limit, and in exceptional circumstances that time limit can be extended by another 12 hours because of the medical condition of the patient or because they've been under the influence of alcohol or drugs. I would conclude then that use of Section 4 in these circumstances could not be justified. And what about Section 1351? I can visualise the following scenarios. Scenario 1. An AMP turns up at a patient's house with a police officer and a doctor in accordance with the requirements under Section 135. Entry is obtained to the property and the AMP and doctor are able to speak to the patient and conduct some form of assessment without removing them to a place of safety where a second doctor can be available. It becomes clear during this assessment that the patient is in such desperate need of medical treatment because of an injury or an overdose that using the Section 135 powers to remove to a place of safety would cause undesirable delay. But Section 4 in this situation is still not really appropriate, as the Section 135 powers could be used to take the patient to the A&E department of the local general hospital and to hold them there while they were receiving urgent medical treatment. In the meantime, a medical doctor could be used for the second medical recommendation if required. Scenario 2. Same as Scenario 1, except that there is no medical need to remove to a hospital. However, the patient manages to evade the police and makes a run for it. This means that, unless they can be apprehended within a 24-hour period, or what is left of it, Section 135 powers cannot be used to facilitate a second doctor assessing the patient. In this situation, it's conceivable that the AMP and the doctor could make an application under Section 4, so that Section 6 powers to apprehend a patient liable to be detained could then be used, and the Section 4 allows 72 hours to locate the patient and take them to hospital. Are there any other circumstances when Section 4 could be used? Interestingly, the code does suggest another situation in which Section 4 might legitimately be used. This is following use of a doctor's holding powers for an inpatient under Section 5.2. Patients detained under Section 5.2 cannot be transferred to another hospital, and the code visualises a situation in which there is an urgent need for the patient to go to another hospital for treatment, security, or other exceptional reasons. However, it points out that the patient would have to agree to this, or if lacking capacity, a best interest decision could be made under the Mental Capacity Act to move them. As the original 5.2 would then end, the receiving hospital could then consider another use of Section 5.2. But there is another option. The code suggests the following. If the conditions are met, an emergency application for detention under Section 4 could be made to the sending hospital. The patient could then be transferred to the receiving hospital. Alternatively, an emergency application under Section 4 could be submitted to the managers of the receiving hospital. So that's something to think about. Thank you for listening. If you find these videos informative or entertaining, please like and subscribe.